welcome to Soul of Travel podcast. I am so happy today to be joined by Nabila Ismael, and she is calling us from Kenya. So I really appreciate you taking the time out of your travel schedule to join us. I love that in these conversations, I really get to connect with people literally around the world. So that's a fun part of this experience. And we've been trying to make this happen for a while. So I'm really excited to be able to bring your story to the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm also really excited that we're finally doing this. It's about time that our timing aligned.
Yeah, certainly it was so much easier at the beginning of this podcast to connect with women as in the pandemic, people weren't traveling as much. And now I am realizing having a podcast talking with women who are seasoned travelers, it makes it a lot more difficult to track people down. But technology and co working spaces like you're in today really allow for us to still stay connected. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
For those of you joining, Nabila is a solo female traveler, entrepreneur, and pharmacist. And like myself and so many of the solo travel guests, a multi passionate woman. And I can't wait to kind of hear how all of these pieces of your story are woven together. Um, I'd love to turn it over to you and give you a moment to introduce yourself and let our listeners know a little bit more about who you are and who you are in the space of travel.
Yeah, thank you. So, like you mentioned, I am a pharmacist by training. And so I worked in the profession and then I always had like a passion for travel and had been traveling. I started at 18, and so it's been a decade of traveling solo. And up until recently, about 8 months ago, I actually left my full time job to kind of give myself some time to breathe, travel some more after the pandemic. And like you mentioned, nobody was traveling. And somewhere along the way, I kind of took content creation and influencing a little bit more seriously, which led to the launch of my travel company, where I organize group trips, mainly targeted for people of color to have a safe and inclusive space. And yeah, and then it's kind of just led to a lot of other things like freelance writing and working with brands. And so it's been quite a journey, but that's my quick bio there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's, I think we'll get into it later, but really that tipping point for you and how quickly that part of your transition grew is pretty exciting. And we'll talk about some of the tools and ways that that happened. But I think that the content you're creating is just really unique and resonant for so many people. So I think that that is probably part of it as well. You mentioned you started traveling at about 18, but when did travel come into your life and what were some of those early impactful travel experiences that really begin to shape who you are and where you are today?
Yeah, that's always a good question because I'm not sure if I can quite pinpoint when travel happened because growing up in the States, my family is Pakistani, so I'm first gen. And when I was young, like from times that I can't even recall, I used to go back and forth because my mom's entire family is there. So I feel like just being on a plane at a young age and going into a completely different world um, probably played a part. And then when I was in high school, I had a French exchange student who came to live with me, and I went to go stay with her for 2 weeks. And so, going to Europe at the age of 14, that was something I never really planned for. And I feel like it's quite a dream to go to Paris and live with someone. So, I think that was like a pocket of like inspiration and my love for travel. And then I think the biggest step probably was when I finished my first year of college and I moved to Spain to be an au pair for 3 months. Kind of combined like, oh, this would be a good work experience to put on my resume. I could practice my Spanish, but I would also like could travel. And I think that's where I was at an age where I like understood that people did this, people could do this. And I met so many other solo travelers and learned that like people took gap years and quit their jobs and whatnot or worked abroad. And that's really when everything kind of opened up for me. And since then, it's kind of been nonstop of travel pretty much.
Yeah, I think that perspective is so valuable because in the US, we don't really think about travel, I think, the same way that so many people around the world think about travel, or especially in Europe. Like, it's so common, like you said, to take a gap year, or to have be a foreign exchange student. Even, it's not as common, for the US students to think about it, but I think it's very common for European students to think about it. And I think it is really important in shaping our worldview and our understanding. And I'm getting ready to travel with my three daughters for a year, and I can't wait to just kind of see who that shapes them into as well. But they are also most excited about Paris. So I think they could relate to your experience of being a 14-year-old and being able to go there. There's something, I don't know why that city has such a magical draw, I think, especially for girls, but they all think it's beautiful.
Yeah, Paris has a chokehold on so many people, and I quite like, can't really figure out what it is, but it still holds that charm for me even now, like 10 years later, 10 years plus. But, okay, I'm gonna have to know more about this year abroad with your 3 daughters. That sounds like an incredible experience, and I'm, like, so excited for you and them. Yeah, I hope to hear more about it either through
Yeah.
this podcast or even later.
Yeah, I would love to share with you. You did mention that some of your earliest travel experiences were going back and forth between Pakistan and New York. And some of the things that I've talked about with other guests is really how travel becomes a bridge to understand, especially, you said, your first generation growing up in the US, like the gap between your US identity, your American identity, and your lineage. And I know for me, international travel and then bringing group travelers actually to the region where I grew up in the US were ways that I really began to see things through new eyes and understand myself and understand where I came from. How did travel help you to really begin to value your culture and yourself and really begin to understand how all that works together?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that it kind of came to me late, to be honest. Like I said, I've been traveling for 10 years, and maybe subconsciously, that was one of the reasons why I traveled and enjoyed it so much. Because I think one of the big focuses while I traveled was like culture. Like that's why I was an au pair, which means like even exchange. So I learned a lot about different cultures like while I was there. And then I did a lot of different projects and opportunities that allowed me to kind of really get into the weeds and learn more about the country that I was visiting. But it never occurred to me that like it never made me really like focus on my own culture, and I kind of didn't really adhere to my culture or really like subscribe to it almost. Like I was very, very much like removed growing up, for reasons that I haven't really figured out, or I guess we could probably like assume. Um, but up until recently, I'd say like the last 2 years, I think I spent a lot more time at home as an adult because of the pandemic. So I moved back home for a little bit to visit after being away from my family during the earlier pandemic. And I saw more of my like cousins and my friends, and like went to a couple of more weddings. And I think I started to realize, it was specifically when I was in Mexico. I was so fascinated to learn the language and to learn how to dance, and just was really, really fascinated. And something clicked, and I was like, wait, for all this time, I've already spoken another language. And it's something that I was embarrassed of. Like, I actually wrote my college entrance exam or essay, about me growing up as like a Pakistani American and how I kind of was like ashamed of it growing up. And so I started to realize, just a couple of years ago, that I had this culture and I was kind of losing it. The language was kind of leaving. And then I kind of just got obsessed with it because it was the easiest one to relearn and to like assimilate into, because it is me. And so in the last 2 years, that's kind of what happened. And then I also kind of noticed that there weren't other South Asian travelers, as many. There are definitely out there, but as many. And once I posted, I would see people comment that. They'd be like, "Oh, I haven't seen another like South Asian," or like a desi, which is like a term that we use colloquially. Um, like traveler, and it's so cool that you do that. And then I would just see it and it'd be a pattern and I was like, wait, like, is this something? And so that's kind of how the group trips also started to come about. And it's kind of what's also led me on this like year-long journey. Like I've mainly been focusing on the Middle East, and actually after Kenya I am going to Pakistan to spend time with my grandparents, and it'll be the first time that I go as an adult. So I'm like excited, nervous, like I don't know what to expect. But yeah, that's the long-winded way, a story of like how culture has played a part and how I've rekindled with it.
Yeah. I love the moment that you shared in Mexico and realizing that, you had been searching for something that was already yours, really. And I think that that really is one of the powerful things about travel. And I think also as a young person, like it's really natural to detach from anything your parents try to give you. And so even if that is this cultural identity, like you try to dismiss it, um and then being able to settle back into that or embrace that part of you once it's yours, I guess, and not something that somebody is trying to like saddle you with, I guess. I don't know how to explain it, but I think that's a process that people go through in general. But then when you're looking at it from this broader lens, like it's such a different experience when it's a completely different lineage or a completely different cultural identity that you're trying to work with. And then also, the idea of speaking a different language and trying to find yourself in a different culture. I think that's also something that is so powerful in travel because like as we move through different places, we really do see parts of ourselves more clearly in our contrast with others and our similarities with others. And so I think that's so cool that, that you witnessed that. And then you also said, you didn't notice it happening until recently. And I think that's the other really important thing is a lot of times people talk about these huge aha moments they had from travel or these transformational experiences, and we often assume it just happened like a light switch. And
Mhm.
often I think that's not the case, is that it does take all of this layering before you see it, or this uncovering before you see it. So I love that, you're just starting to see that. And I think that gives a lot of people permission to not put that pressure on themselves that they have been traveling and seeking and maybe not found that revelation yet.
Yeah, no, definitely. I also wanted to add that another thing that kind of made me realize this was when I would travel to other countries, I am often people will assume or ask, they're like, "Oh, are you Indian?" And I'll tell them I'm Pakistani, but they'll usually admire the culture or be like, "Oh my gosh, like I love watching Bollywood," or something like that. And hearing my culture being shared and like celebrated in a positive way, which it hasn't always been in my childhood and growing up. Um, I think that's also something that kind of made me like the way that I would admire the Mexican culture and want to learn how to salsa dance or speak Spanish, someone else would say the same thing. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like, I do have like this beautiful culture. Like, we have great dances and our language and our food. Like things that I didn't really realize, but hearing it shared so positively around the world, where we might not have anything else really in common, but people would be like, "Oh yeah, I've seen this," or like, "It's so cool that you're Indian. I haven't seen a Pakistani person before." It would always be a point of conversation, but it was more so positive, and that's kind of what had also led to like this revelation. And you're right, it has not been an aha moment. Nothing about like traveling, especially when I quit my job. I thought I'd have so many aha moments, but everything has been such a slow build. But I really recommend journaling because that's when you can kind of trace back and realize, like, oh, yeah, there have been small changes, but they're definitely there.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like that's such an important process is journaling, reflecting, integrating, and then seeing those moments afterward. You mentioned sharing on Instagram and kind of the feedback and responses you would get. And recognizing that maybe there was a need for community and for travel that was serving other South Asian women and encouraging them to travel solo, which led you to creating your own travel company. um, I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of the conversations that happen within this space and some of the obstacles that you see members of your community facing, or how community has been supporting each other, and really what changes you've seen in representation of South Asian women travelers as you've stepped into this space. Because before you said you knew there were some, but you weren't always seeing it. And I think once we immerse ourselves, we start to see more than we recognized. But I would just love to hear from you what that experience has been like.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. There some of the challenges, I guess, are definitely the same ones that I experienced, but for whatever reason, I guess since I've been traveling for so long, they have like slipped my mind, or like I forget that they were challenges. But a lot of it has been definitely just the representation in the travel space, but also a lot to do with like race and feeling safe while traveling. Like a lot of the questions that I get is like, oh, where do you recommend to go as a person of color or a South Asian or Indian or Pakistani woman, like, or a brown traveler? Those are all like the terms that are used. But where are some countries you felt safe, or like, um, another question is like, how did you get your community to be okay with it? It's not really common. Our culture is very family based. For women specifically, I can only speak to women because that's how I identify. But that to go travel alone, it just isn't something that like a lot of us have done or our families have done, especially since like a lot of the people who follow me are either first gen, and so they just didn't have opportunities to even travel. And so we weren't really, I wasn't really brought up with like travel being an opportunity or some, it was a luxury that I would get to do when maybe I retired. Um, and so I guess since posting about it, I have seen people just echoing that and saying that it's so refreshing to see. But they feel more comfortable going in groups, like to go together. Like it'd be so nice to have a like-minded group or someone with the same background who understands like how difficult this is to get approval from family, or to like go do something like for themselves even, because travel again is like a luxury. So yeah, I would say it's been a lot of different things. But I think my journey specifically, because I kind of followed the traditional route of going down and getting a doctorate. Growing up, I either had to get a doctorate or be a lawyer or an engineer. And so I got my doctorate in pharmacy and I went down that traditional path, but then I slowly pivoted into tech, and then I became an entrepreneur and pursued something creative full time, which also I feel like going after your passions isn't always the easiest thing, or a luxury people even have. And so a lot of it has been more so about my career journey as well, and how I've just completely changed course over and over again. So yeah.
Yeah, I think especially as women, we find all these roles that we are expected to step into, and culturally, then there's added layers to that, all over the world. You know, there's so many different uh, ways that women feel they need to show up based on who they are and where they've grown up and all these other parameters. And I think creating conversations and safe space to kind of unpack some of that is really important. And it's so interesting how travel becomes the place where those conversations land. Like we could be having those conversations in a lot of different arenas, but travel somehow seems to pull those people together and allow for these conversations in a different way. So I love hearing about that. And then you also, you know, mentioned that you do have your PhD, and chose to kind of follow that set of expectations, but then realized at some point that that wasn't in alignment with who you really wanted to be, or didn't fully allow you to be who you wanted to be. I would love to talk a little bit more about how you do still bring that into your travels today. And I know that you're really passionate about global health and travel medicine, and are an ambassador with an NGO to talk about education and global health. So it's like this beautiful space where you can bring both things together. What work are you doing there right now?
Yeah, so I do have my PharmD, and I think because not I'm not using it anymore in the traditional sense, it's still really important to me and brings me a lot of joy. And so even when I was in pharmacy school, I was really focused on the global aspect because of my love for travel and culture and the world, essentially. So I did a lot of work. I won a research grant to go to Uganda, and then I did my clinicals in Zimbabwe for a short bit. And so that was kind of always the plan, even if I stayed on the traditional course of being a pharmacist and either working in a hospital or a community pharmacy. But now, because I'm traveling, I have the opportunity to see healthcare literally where I am. And so I don't know if it's just me because like that's the profession I went down to, but every time I walk by a pharmacy, I feel like I need to go in and talk to the pharmacist and be like, oh yeah, I'm a pharmacist, like hear how they're doing, what their challenges are, and kind of just learn about pharmacy from their point of view. So I nearly do that in every country I go to. Um, and so I get to learn a little bit and like expand my network and meet a lot of cool people. And I have also kind of pivoted even my travel content to be about travel health and travel medicine. So last year I took a travel medicine course, which was really fascinating and has allowed me to lean into that. And because of my unique background, I don't only just talk about travel, I talk about healthcare. And so I have a good following from who are interested in both. And so it's allowed me to work with NGOs and like consult. So, like I mentioned, after I was a community pharmacist, I went into health tech. And so I have a marketing background in tech. And so I still do that on the side. And then because I'm traveling, I will either volunteer at an NGO like I did in Lebanon for a month. Um, and then um, I actually, oddly enough, I got dengue fever over the summer in Bali and I posted about it. And so I have used my own experiences to talk about it. And that's led me to do more work. Like, in short, the video went viral and I didn't expect it to. And then I kind of was able to use that as an opportunity to be like a speaker and like work with different NGOs to talk about infectious diseases and travel health. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. And that brings me a lot of joy because it really truly bridges like the two things I'm passionate about, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's so amazing. And I love hearing that you kind of find yourself in pharmacies all over the world and having those conversations. Because one of the things I talk a lot about with my guests is when you're looking at how to create a positive impact and align that with travel, that there's not only one way to do it. And that usually the most effective way is to find the thing you're already passionate about and turn that into your impact. And I think most people have some underlying passion that can be turned into both travel and positive impact. Like we said, like travel kind of really brings everything together because you can bring what you're interested in somewhere else, and so that helps you to kind of evolve in that way. And also it's so interesting how these things that like no one would really want to have dengue fever, right? I'm sure you can speak to that firsthand. When I was traveling in Thailand, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, definitely connecting with a lot of people that had malaria or had dengue in the past, and like hearing their experiences of how they were cared for, their access to healthcare. Those things were pretty interesting to me as well. And I have a background in sociology, so I tend to look at things from that lens. So I'll find myself also asking questions that people are like, why are you asking that? I'm like, oh, well, because I'm just trying to understand everything about everything. That's really my my modem when I'm traveling. But I just think it's so interesting to see how people start to weave together all of their passions, and once you kind of find that spot of balance and harmony where you've gotten all the things together is when you see that kind of growth, like you mentioned, that this unexpected post went viral that allowed you to open all of these other doors. um what did that feel like for you to kind of step into that authentic space of your voice and your passions?
Honestly, I'm still in disbelief, even just sharing that with you. I'm just like, how did that happen? And like, I'm just so surprised. And I guess I'm also just really happy I didn't give up because, like, even a few years ago, I would say this, like, I want to use my degree in pharmacy, but I want it to use it in some way that's, like, creative, and I still wanna be able to travel. And I would just get weird looks, and I would realize that, like, that is such a vague statement, like, what does that mean? Like, I don't know what kind of career that is. And so when I was graduating, I was so panicked. I was like, "I don't know what I wanna be doing, and, like, nobody else can help me because it's so vague, and, like, I don't know if it even exists." Um and, like, to think that that was 3 years ago, and now I've made, like, this switch where it's really hard to, like, define my career because, like you said, it's so multi-hyphenate, and I'm doing a lot of different things, but, yeah, I'm just so happy that I'm here and that somehow travel and healthcare go together, and I think I wouldn't have even realized that, um, unfortunately. I think the pandemic was kind of where those things, like, intersected for a lot of people, and it was a unique way for me to take my expertise as a pharmacist, but having also traveled for so long, and it was an article that I wrote for Forbes that kind of led me to go down this like niche, if you will, of like travel health or the traveling pharmacist. Um, and so honestly, I'm just really happy to be here and that like people find the content and what I'm doing interesting, because I wouldn't believe that I'd be here now.
Yeah, it's interesting how much clarity the like off kilter and off balance way that we were living during the pandemic like brought clarity. It's just like that enough of that shift to knock us out of our routine and our comfort zones kind of like had us opening our eyes to different possibilities. And I think so many people found new ways of being. And obviously in travel we had to get creative. If you were either a traveler or a travel professional, everything that we knew didn't exist anymore, so you were already kind of thinking in a different way. That's really where this podcast came from. I get really frustrated sometimes thinking about the fact that I launched a travel company weeks before the pandemic and then because of the pandemic, this happened. And I really think for me, this was my actual path. And I would have stayed, really focused on my travel company and not done this. And this was really important. And now I can like bring them together, but also my travel business has a slightly different focus because much like you, like I kind of had all these things that were interesting. Like I'm like, how do I bring like community and a sociological perspective and gender equity and sustainability together with travel? Like these things at some point seemed pretty disconnected and now they seem so obviously connected. So I think for people listening, that's a really valuable thing too. Just like if something is really important to you, don't discount it. Like you will find a way to kind of weave it into your story.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good message.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't make sense or you don't see where it'll take you, just keep at it.
Yeah. Well, is there any other advice? We've talked a little bit about your travel experiences, but for female solo travelers or people who really have found barriers to travel in their way, what would you share with them in order to encourage them to get out there and take those first travel experiences or things that would maybe help support them along the way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say really focus on like why you're looking to solo travel, and like focus on like what that means to you. But also, I like to start small and like test the waters a little bit. So if it's something so big and scary, maybe try like taking yourself on a solo date or starting small, like going on a road trip where you're still in your like home city, same language, like you have your SIM card, your health insurance. You don't have to think about all these other things that might seem like daunting, but I think really learning to be okay in your own company is kind of one really big factor of solo traveling because once you feel confident with like your own company, then you can kind of take on anything else. And then I would also recommend following like creators or people who inspire you and feel like you see representation and identify with your values, because I think that always helps, or it has helped even me in like a lot of ways, like even with like my career switch and like who I follow and places I go to. Like I have changed and become more intentional with like the information I consume, and that's also kind of helped me shift my mindset from like having fear to kind of like being empowered. And so just really consuming content that allows me to do things that I want to do. And so if there are naysayers who say like you shouldn't travel alone or a woman shouldn't travel alone, like I would change that to look at people who are doing it and kind of just reframe my mindset. So I think those are like initial tips that I'd have for people who are looking to travel alone.
Yeah. And I think it's so amazing how you mentioned kind of intentionally curating your social media and the content that you're consuming, because there's so much out there, but you can find what really supports you. And I think that that is such a cool thing. Like, I'll notice every once in a while, I must have clicked on something that wasn't right, and my Instagram feed shifts, and I'm like, what? This isn't me. So then I like have to pull back in the things that I really want to see. But it is a space for me where I actually can learn a lot and feel like I'm being supported in my passions and be educated. And it doesn't become as much the beast that it can be for some people. And also, you know, kind of in finding your own voice, I would love for you to talk a little bit too for people who might also be interested in content creation and um, trying to figure out how they can make their own way. What would you suggest to them in really trying to find their own way to stand out?
Yeah, I would say it's not a race, it's a journey. So I've been at it for a really long time, and I'm by no means like a huge influencer or anything like that. But for me, I've always stayed very authentic, and I think that has been really helpful for myself. It's like a photo diary, a visual diary of everything, and to really post content that you enjoy. Like, don't do it for the numbers. Stay authentic, because I think that's kind of what's going to make it in this content creation world. Like some people always say that it's so saturated and stuff, like how am I going to make it? And the only advice I have is to be consistent and be authentic, like post what makes sense to you. Like I struggled in the beginning when I started because I would post about pharmacy and then I'd post about travel, and I was like, I don't have a niche. Like this is like scrambled. This is all over the place. And once I started to embrace that, that's exactly when all of this stuff started to happen. And then I threw in like the South Asian bit, like, because that was really important to me. And I focused on the solo travel or the budget travel, but I would still like post something about pharmacy. Like you'll have travel photos and then you'll have something about my career. And so I would say stay true to who you are and post things that like fuel you and gets you excited. Like that's the best, when you can speak from the heart and you don't have to like try to be someone else. I feel like the content creation comes a lot easier too.
Yeah. And I think people resonate with it so much more. Like you might be an influencer that has so many followers, but you're not going to be resonating with everybody. So if you're creating that content that's so generalized that many people are following you, it doesn't have as much value, I would say personally. And so I think it's such an amazing space to create a positive impact and create community if you are being authentic to who you are, and then finding the other people that have similar journeys and similar interests. And I think that that can be a way that we can really create more impact in that sphere. So I love that you shared that. And I think it takes the pressure off too for people who are looking to get into this space, because if you can just show up as who you are, that's easier, right? Like you don't have to try and fit this thing and fit this thing. I do think there's a struggle in identifying who you are. I'm not saying that part is easy, but just expressing that and working through that part of your journey is also really authentic, and people will resonate with that as well. So instead of trying to be everything to everyone, just being true to yourself and trying to reach your audience. I think that in business and in, you know, create content creation, that feels like the truest way to be for me.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I think the last couple of years, the rise in social media has shown that like you can literally post anything. It could be like your face, like with no makeup on, you could be dancing in your basement. Like the barrier to entry has definitely changed and it's no longer about like a curated aesthetic form. It's more just like raw and real. And I think that that's what people really like. And so it's been really interesting to see that shift. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we were even talking about it before we jumped on this call, that we were talking about, is the sound right? Is the lighting right? Is this right? And I was like, as long as I can hear you and connect with you, that's the most important thing for me. And I think that uh, is one thing I love about podcasting too, is that there's a low barrier to entry and a lot of people can get into this space and they can tell their story and their voice can be heard and it doesn't have to be done in a certain way. So I think it's so exciting. Well, before we end our conversation, I would love for you to share how our listeners can find you. And then I also have a series of rapid fire questions to end our conversation.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you can definitely find me on Instagram or TikTok under Dose of Travel, or my website, www.doseoftravel.co, not .com.
Great. Well, what are you reading right now?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I have to look at my app. I just started one yesterday. Oh, Love on the Brain. It's a little rom-com.
Excellent. What is always in your suitcase or backpack when you travel?
Uh, my camera.
To sojourn is to travel somewhere as you live there for a short while. Where is some place that you would still love to sojourn?
Beirut, Lebanon.
What do you eat that immediately connects you to a place that you've been?
Oh, biryani. It reminds me of Pakistan.
Who is a person that inspired or encouraged you to set out and explore the world?
Ooh, this is a good one. I would say my best friend, Anisha. She's always been a support. She's also South Asian, and she's always been super supportive of me traveling when it wasn't always common to do that.
Yeah. If you could take an adventure with one person, fictional or real, alive or past, who would it be?
Jeez, I wasn't ready for these. um, mm, I'm still gonna go with my best friend.
Awesome. And the last one, Soul of Travel is a space for honoring women in the tourism industry. Who is one person in the travel industry you would love to recognize here in this space?
Mm, mm, mm. Um, I'd say Lexi Limitless. She's a travel creator who has visited all of the countries. Um, and I just love her fierce. She's just really fearless in her travels. So yeah, say Lexi.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm glad that we finally got to do this. It was a really fun conversation, and I'm grateful for you giving us your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Thank you.